Well, good evening and welcome to this special edition half hour of Reality Check. Tonight we're taking a look at what is really happening in the Republican Party in 2012. To the casual observer, it might look like a typical campaign season. A slew of Republican candidates at the beginning of the year started off the Republican race. If you remember, that field of candidates, well, it looked like this. Businessman Herman Cain, Minnesota Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann, Texas Governor Rick Perry, former Utah Governor Jon Huntsman, former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney. There was former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich, Texas Congressman Ron Paul, former Pennsylvania Senator Rick Santorum. And as you also know, the field has narrowed. Only weeks ago, we were down to just four: Romney, Santorum, Gingrich, and Paul. But it was in early April when Rick Santorum, who many of the pundits claimed was the real challenger to Romney, decided to suspend his campaign. Only a couple of weeks later, Gingrich did the same. Both candidates quickly endorsed Mitt Romney, which meant we were down to just these two. But according to the national media, that really wasn't the case. We were actually down to one: former Governor Romney. The media saying that he was the presumptive nominee. But what the national media has not told the public is that the Republican race is not won through a series of state contests. It's won by accumulating delegates at state conventions. Those delegates go on to vote for the nominee at the Republican National Convention in Tampa. And as a result, the national media has ignored two very important facts about the Republican race. Let's take a look. The first fact here: even though former Governor Mitt Romney has won many of these beauty contests, he's actually only won a few hundred delegates. That's because the majority of states have not yet held their state conventions to choose delegates. Now, that's not to say that Romney will not be the Republican nominee. He very well may be, but he's not yet. The other fact that they have ignored is that in the states that have held their contests, Texas Congressman Ron Paul is winning large numbers of delegates, and that is leading to massive fights at state conventions across the country. It's also leading many people to take over the GOP leadership in a number of these states, and those people happen to be Paul's supporters. That has also led to Governor Mitt Romney creating a shadow party in some of these states. We're going to get to all of that in just a moment, break it down for you. But before we do, and you may be watching and saying to yourself, what are you talking about? Earlier this week, Ron Paul ended his campaign, didn't he? After all, that was the headline on newspapers and TV stations across the country. It was all over Twitter. Ron Paul drops out. But is it true? Tonight, we begin there. Well, the articles have been everywhere, from Fox News to the LA Times, the AP, even Newsmax. Paul is out. Ron Paul drops out. The headlines are pretty clear, but they are wrong. The actual statement from the Paul campaign explains that Congressman Paul will no longer actively campaign in the remaining 11 primaries. That includes Texas, California, and New Jersey, states where TV buys are very expensive. So doesn't that mean the campaign is over? Well, if you watch Reality Check often, then you, better than most, know that's not at all true. In the case of the Washington Times article cited by the Drudge Report, it goes on to explain something that most people might not even understand. Mr. Paul said he will continue to work to win delegates in states that have already voted and where the process of delegate selection is playing out. So what is the strategy here? Well, it's pretty simple. Between now and the end of June, most states will select their national delegates for Tampa. And it's in the fight for these delegates where the nomination will be won or lost. Case in point, this past weekend, two big contests were held in Arizona and in Oklahoma. Arizona has 29 delegates, Oklahoma 43. Let's start with Arizona, which was won in the primary by Romney. But the majority of people who showed up on Saturday for the delegate caucus, well, they were Paul supporters, and things got pretty ugly. Reports on Saturday night were that Paul took 11 of 18 delegates decided in the district caucuses. The remaining 11 at-large delegates, well, they were left up in the air. You see, the Romney forces, they stalled for hours, but Romney supporters got so tired of waiting, they finally began to leave the convention. In a last-ditch effort, the Romney forces tried to declare there was now no quorum, and other motions were offered. When a vote for the at-large delegates was finally taken, instead of being read aloud, it was sealed, put under lock and key with a promise that GOP leadership tomorrow would count those and sort things out. It took them 3 days to count those, and the list finally emerged. Now we know Paul has only 3 delegates and Romney 26. People in Arizona not very happy. Then you have the convention in Oklahoma. Santorum and Romney forces united to shut out the Ron Paul people at the Oklahoma State GOP convention. By some estimates, Ron Paul supporters were a majority on the floor of the convention and thus should have walked away with another win. More than half of the people attending the convention were Paul supporters. The GOP leadership in this case, they delayed the caucus. They cited their own clerical errors. And then on the premise that the time for the convention hall rental was coming to an end, they refused to hold a final vote on credentials or to acknowledge the calls for a roll call vote on the delegates or the alternates. And that's required under the rules. Finally, they moved to dismiss. So the convention was moved outside and continued in a parking lot across the street.
Basically, we decided to hold what's called a rump convention, and we took our contingent outside and we redid all the business of the convention, and we've got results to show for that, including nominations of delegates and alternates to the National Convention.
Keep in mind, during the earlier meeting, the GOP in Oklahoma did not conclude business, nor did they elect the delegates properly. The folks from Oklahoma who continued the convention afterward, well, they tell me everything was done according to the rules, and their slate of delegates is legit. So here's what you need to know. Oklahoma delegates from the Paul side, they are filing a legal challenge and now saying that they plan to go to Tampa regardless because they won't be cheated out of their vote. And that's been the same story from one state to the next. Listen, if you assume that the AP narrative of Romney being only 200 delegates away from the nomination at this point is true, well, then you just might be in for a surprise come August. And that is Reality Check. So clearly, Congressman Paul, not out of the race just yet. And with state conventions in Georgia, Minnesota, Michigan, and Mississippi this weekend, things could be very interesting. Interesting enough that the RNC and Mitt Romney now setting up what are called shadow parties in states where the GOP leadership is now no longer run by the establishment. So what exactly is a shadow party? And why would that be necessary? I'll tell you after the break.